January 17th, 1943, East Prussia, Luftwaffe base Insterburg, 0447 hours. The frost clung to the tarmac like a second skin. In the pre-dawn darkness, a Luftwaffe mechanic named Klaus Reinhardt stood beneath the wing of his Focke-Wulf 190, breath crystallizing in the bitter air. His hands, numbed despite heavy gloves, worked methodically over the engine cowling, tightening bolts that had loosened during yesterday's sortie. Around him, the airfield lay silent save for the distant cough of a diesel generator and the occasional bark of a guard dog. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with coal smoke from the heating stoves in the ready room. Reinhardt paused, flexing his fingers, and looked eastward toward the gradually lightening horizon. In 6 hours, he would be airborne again. In 6 hours, he would witness something that defied every tactical assumption his commanders had drilled into him since 1939. He did not know it yet, but the Americans were coming back. The strategic bombing campaign over occupied Europe had begun with such promise for the defenders. Throughout 1942, the Luftwaffe had watched with professional satisfaction as British bombers limped home in the darkness, their formations shattered, their losses mounting. The Germans had developed a system, a brutal, efficient machine of interception that combined ground radar, searchlight batteries, flak corridors, and night fighters into a web of death that consumed RAF crews at an unsustainable rate. Bomber Command's casualty figures told the story. Some raids saw losses exceeding 15%. At that rate, crews had virtually no statistical chance of surviving a full tour of operations. The mathematics were simple, cold, final. Then came the Americans, and with them, a different doctrine entirely. The United States Army Air Forces arrived in England throughout 1942 with a theory that Berlin's military planners considered dangerously naive, that heavily armed bombers, flying in tight defensive formations during daylight hours, could fight their way to any target in Europe and return without fighter escort. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress embodied this philosophy, bristling with 1350 caliber machine guns, armored at critical points, capable of absorbing punishment that would tear lesser aircraft apart. The B-17 was designed not to evade, but to endure. American airmen called it the Fort. They believed in it with an almost religious fervor. German pilots, veterans of the Eastern Front and the Battle of Britain, initially regarded these American formations with something approaching contempt. The B-17s flew in broad daylight, advertising their approach hours in advance. They maintained rigid geometric formations that prioritized mutual defensive fire over evasive maneuvers. They seemed to invite attack, and in the autumn of 1942, the Luftwaffe accepted that invitation eagerly. On August 17, 1942, 12 B-17s attacked the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in the first American heavy bomber raid against occupied France. The Germans watched, analyzed, and prepared. By October, when the Americans began striking targets deeper into the continent, Luftwaffe fighter groups had developed specific tactics for dismantling the American formations. Attack from head-on, where the bomber's defensive armament was weakest. Concentrate fire on the cockpit and engines. Target the lead aircraft to disrupt navigation and bombing accuracy. Above all, press home the attack with absolute commitment, passing through the formation close enough to feel the heat of American gun barrels. It worked. Throughout the winter of 1942 and into the spring of 1943, American losses mounted. On April 17, 1943, 16 B-17s were lost, attacking the Focke-Wulf plant at Bremen, a loss rate approaching 20%. The survivors returned to England with aircraft so damaged that ground crews stood in silent disbelief, counting the holes, the shattered equipment, the blood frozen on aluminum surfaces. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging trained crews faster than the replacement pipeline could supply them. The Germans studied the wreckage of shot-down B-17s with methodical thoroughness. They marveled at certain aspects of American engineering, the superchargers that maintained power at altitude, the oxygen systems, the sophisticated bomb sights. But they also noted what they considered fundamental weaknesses. American armor, while present, seemed distributed without the focused efficiency of German design. The bombers carried enormous quantities of equipment the Luftwaffe considered unnecessary weight, extra radios, heating systems, creature comforts. Most tellingly, the Americans seemed unable to accept losses philosophically. Captured airmen spoke of 7-day rest leaves, of hot food, of heated barracks and regular mail service. They showed photographs of wives and girlfriends, carried good luck charms, personalized their aircraft with painted names and nose art. They fought, the Germans concluded, like amateurs who believed the war would accommodate their sentimentality. In May 1943, a Luftwaffe intelligence officer named Major Heinrich Bäumer compiled a report based on interrogations of American prisoners and analysis of combat footage. His conclusion reflected the prevailing view. The enemy demonstrates technical competence but lacks the ideological fortitude for sustained operations under pressure. His material advantages cannot compensate for this spiritual deficiency. Current loss rates will force a fundamental revision of American bombing doctrine within 6 months. Bäumer's report reached Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin, where it joined similar assessments from other analysts. The consensus was clear. The Americans would either abandon daylight bombing or suffer catastrophic losses that would cripple the 8th Air Force as an effective striking force. Either outcome served German strategic interests. Then came Schweinfurt. On August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after that first tentative raid on Rouen, the 8th Air Force launched 376 B-17s against 2 targets deep in southern Germany, the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the Messerschmitt works at Regensburg. The distances involved placed both targets beyond the range of escort fighters. The bombers would fly unprotected through the most heavily defended airspace in the world, strike their objectives, and fight their way home through an aroused hornet's nest of German interceptors. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commander of Jagdgeschwader 54, received the alert at his base in northeastern Germany while shaving. The morning intelligence briefing confirmed the scale of the American effort. Multiple large formations, heavy bombers, heading southeast. Trautloft, a veteran with 58 confirmed kills, permitted himself a thin smile. The Americans were coming to him, offering themselves in daylight at a distance that prevented fighter escort. He calculated quickly. His Geschwader could cycle through multiple attack runs, rearming and refueling between waves. The American formations would be under continuous assault for over an hour. He briefed his pilots in the ready room, their faces eager and professional. Most were combat veterans who respected their opponent's courage while considering their tactics fundamentally flawed. "Gentlemen," Trautloft told them, "we will make this a demonstration. We will show what happens when the Americans venture beyond their protective umbrella. Choose your targets, press your attacks, and make each pass count." The interception began over Belgium. German fighters rose in groups of 30 and 40, forming up at altitude before plunging into the American formations in textbook coordination. Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s came from 12 o'clock high, diving through the bomber streams with cannons blazing, then breaking away to loop around for another pass. The concentrated firepower shredded the lead elements. B-17s began falling away from their formations, trailing smoke and fire, their crews tumbling out in desperate bailouts. Inside the American bombers, the reality was more terrible than any training exercise had suggested. The fighter attacks came in waves that seemed endless. The noise was overwhelming. The hammering of 50-caliber guns, the thunder of exploding cannon shells, the shriek of wind through torn metal, the shouted warnings over interphones. The plexiglass nose sections offered their occupants a panoramic view of German fighters boring in head-on, growing from specks to lethal machines in seconds, their wing roots sparkling with muzzle flashes. Bombardiers and navigators, armed only with single handheld machine guns, stood upright and fired back, knowing they faced opponents equipped with 20mm cannons and armor plate. Lieutenant Robert Rosenthal, piloting a B-17 named Rosie's Riveters, watched 2 aircraft from his squadron disintegrate within minutes. A direct hit on one bomber's bomb bay triggered a sympathetic detonation that vaporized the aircraft instantly. There one moment, a spreading cloud of debris the next. Another fort fell away with its entire nose section shot away, the pilots visible at their controls as the aircraft began its final dive. Rosenthal held formation, correcting for the turbulence as the formation contracted around the gaps left by lost aircraft. The Germans attacked for 3 hours with a ferocity born of tactical advantage and home defense imperatives. Every Luftwaffe base within range scrambled its fighters. Some German pilots flew 4 sorties that day, landing only long enough to refuel and rearm before climbing back into the sky. The engagement became a rolling battle stretching across southern Germany, a contest of endurance and ammunition supply. When the surviving bombers finally turned for home, German pilots circled above, counting the empty spaces in the American formations. 60 B-17s had been destroyed, a loss rate of 16%. For the Luftwaffe pilots landing at bases from Munich to Hamburg, the day's work seemed to confirm every tactical assumption. Several pilots reported seeing the same aircraft multiple times, recognizing distinctive tail markings or nose art, and noting the progressive damage accumulating on each American bomber. It seemed impossible that such battered aircraft could remain airborne, yet they staggered onward, their formations ragged but unbroken. Klaus Reinhardt, the mechanic, watched the German fighters land that evening at Insterburg. The pilots climbed from their cockpits exhausted, their flight suits dark with sweat despite the altitude cold, their hands shaking slightly from adrenaline depletion. In the debriefing room, the intelligence officers tallied the claims. 147 American bombers reported destroyed. The actual figure was 60, but in the chaos of multiple fighters attacking the same targets, overclaiming was inevitable and understood. What mattered was the broader picture. The Americans had been savaged. Major Boehmer updated his assessment that night. Enemy demonstrated surprising resilience, but losses confirm unsustainability of current doctrine. Recommend continued pressure. Psychological collapse of American bomber crews anticipated within 60 to 90 days. The Americans did not collapse. They returned. On September 6, 1943, Stuttgart. On September 27, Emden. On October 4th, Frankfurt. On October 8th, Bremen again. And on October 14th, Black Thursday, Schweinfurt once more. This second Schweinfurt raid became infamous in American bomber circles as the worst day of the air war. Of 291 B-17s dispatched, 60 were shot down, and another 17 so badly damaged they never flew again. The 381st Bombardment Group lost 9 of 22 aircraft dispatched. The 305th lost 13. For several bomb groups, entire squadrons ceased to exist as functional units. The Luftwaffe pilots landing after Black Thursday were jubilant. Oberst Trautloft filed a report predicting the imminent suspension of American daylight operations. The enemy has demonstrated remarkable courage, but has reached the limits of acceptable loss rates. His crews are exhausted, his replacement situation critical. We anticipate a shift to night operations, or a significant operational pause. The operational pause did come, but not for the reasons Trautloft anticipated. For 6 days after Schweinfurt, weather over Germany remained unflyable. When it cleared on October 20th, the Americans launched a small raid against Düren. Then silence again, more weather. More time for both sides to absorb the implications of October's battles. In those quiet days, something subtle but profound began registering in German intelligence reports. Shot down American bombers, when examined, showed something unexpected. Repair work, not field expedient patches but comprehensive structural rebuilds. Aircraft that had been written off as total losses after previous raids were returning to combat with new sections grafted onto old airframes. Wings replaced, tail sections swapped out, engines exchanged. The Americans were not simply repairing damage, they were practicing industrial-scale resurrection. A Luftwaffe technical intelligence team examining the wreckage of a B-17 shot down near Osnabrück discovered production data plates indicating the aircraft had been manufactured in Seattle in March 1943, but they also found modification tags from depots in England dated September, after Schweinfurt. This particular aircraft had been rebuilt at least twice. It had flown combat missions, sustained major damage, been reconstructed, and returned to operations multiple times. The discovery troubled the analysts more than any tactical development. When operations resumed in November, German pilots began noticing something else. American formations were growing larger, not smaller. On November 3rd, 5:39, heavy bombers attacked Wilhelmshaven, nearly double the force that had struck Schweinfurt. On November 26th, more than 400 bombers hit Bremen. The Americans were not retreating or conserving forces. They were expanding their offensive despite losses that should have forced retrenchment. Klaus Reinhardt, servicing his Focke-Wulf between sorties, listened to his pilots describe the American formations with increasing unease. "There are more of them," one pilot reported flatly. "We shoot down 10 and 20 appear. We damage 50 and they return the next day. Where are they all coming from?" The answer lay across the Atlantic, in a production system the Germans had fundamentally failed to comprehend. In 1943, American factories produced 85,898 aircraft. German production that same year totaled 24,807 aircraft. But the disparity extended beyond mere numbers. The Americans had built an entirely new industrial infrastructure dedicated to aircraft production. Factories that had been producing automobiles or refrigerators in 1940 were turning out bombers by 1943. The Boeing plant in Seattle, the Douglas facilities in Long Beach and Oklahoma City, the Consolidated factory in Fort Worth. These vast complexes operated around the clock, their assembly lines staffed by workers who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor. More significantly, the Americans had implemented a systematic approach to design that prioritized maintenance and repair. B-17 components were modular and interchangeable. A wing section damaged beyond field repair could be replaced entirely with a new unit. Engines were swapped out rather than overhauled in place. The entire philosophy reflected an assumption of abundance that German engineers, working within a resource-constrained environment, found almost incomprehensible. But it was not merely production capacity that confounded German calculations. It was the American logistical system supporting it. The conveyor belt of replacement crews, spare parts, ammunition, and fuel that flowed from the United States to England in an unending stream. German U-boats sank supply ships, but the convoys kept coming. Luftwaffe bombers hit English airfields, but the Americans simply moved operations, repaired runways, rebuilt facilities, and resumed operations. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots began manifesting in subtle ways. Veteran pilots who had flown with confidence in October began mentioning the unsettling experience of attacking American formations and seeing them reform after suffering casualties. The Americans did not break. They did not scatter. They absorbed losses, tightened their formations, and continued to target. Individual bombers, engines shot out, controls damaged, would drop out of formation, but the formation itself persisted. Hauptmann Heinrich Erler, a decorated pilot with 209 confirmed kills, described his frustration in a letter to his wife. "We shoot them down in numbers that should terrify any rational enemy. Yet the next day, they return, seemingly undiminished. It is like fighting the heads of the Hydra. Cut off one, and two grow in its place. Their material resources appear limitless." In December 1943, a new element entered the equation: long-range escort fighters. The North American P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could now accompany the bombers to targets deep inside Germany. The comfortable days of multiple attack runs, landing to rearm, and returning to the battle were ending. Now German fighters faced American fighters over their own territory, and the tactical calculus shifted dramatically. On January 11, 1944, the 8th Air Force dispatched 663 heavy bombers against targets in central Germany, the largest formation yet assembled. The German controllers watching the raid develop on radar screens could scarcely believe the scope. Nearly 700 aircraft penetrating German airspace in broad daylight. The numbers seemed to invalidate everything they understood about sustainable operational tempo. Oberst Trautloft, scrambling his fighters for the interception, experienced a moment of profound unease. His Geschwader had claimed hundreds of American bombers destroyed over the past 6 months. His pilots were veterans, skilled and aggressive. Yet the Americans kept coming, their formations larger, their tactics refined, their determination apparently unshakable. For the first time, Trautloft wondered whether German intelligence had fundamentally misread not just American capabilities, but American character. The battle that day was savage and indecisive. German fighters downed 39 bombers, but American escort fighters destroyed 28 German aircraft, an exchange ratio that favored the defenders tactically, but meant nothing strategically when the Americans could replace their losses within days, while German pilot training programs struggled to produce qualified replacements. In the intelligence debriefing that evening, one of Troutloft's younger pilots, a replacement fresh from training school, asked a question that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. "Herr Oberst, where are all the American aircraft coming from? We shot down 60 at Schweinfurt, yet today they brought 600. How is this possible?" Troutloft had no answer that would satisfy the young pilot, because the truth was difficult to articulate. The Americans were waging a different kind of war, one in which industrial capacity substituted for tactical perfection, where acceptable losses meant anything survivable, where the objective was not to win individual battles, but to exhaust the enemy through sheer material persistence. By February 1944, the phenomenon that would later be called Big Week made the disparity undeniable. Over 6 days, the 8th Air Force flew nearly 3,800 bomber sorties against German aircraft production facilities. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them and suffered devastating losses. 355 fighters destroyed, 100 pilots killed, another 100 wounded. The Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 escort fighters, grievous casualties by any measure, yet within days the lost aircraft had been replaced and operations resumed at full intensity. Klaus Reinhardt, watching the daily reports tacked to the board in his squadron's ready room, began keeping a private tally in his notebook. The numbers told a story his officers would not acknowledge. German fighter strength was eroding despite tactical successes. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. Fuel shortages meant reduced training hours for new pilots, which meant those pilots died faster, which meant more replacements were needed, which meant even less training time. The spiral was tightening. In March 1944, American bombers began appearing over Berlin in formations of 500 and 600 aircraft. The symbolic significance was not lost on German civilians or military leadership. The capital of the Reich, the seat of power, was being struck in daylight by an enemy who had been expected to collapse under pressure months earlier. The sound of those formations became a psychological weapon in itself. The deep, droning thunder of 2,000 Wright Cyclone engines at altitude was audible for miles, a sustained mechanical growl that announced American presence with unmistakable authority. For German civilians huddled in air raid shelters, the sound persisted for 20 or 30 minutes as the formations passed overhead, an eternity of noise that drove home the message of American reach and persistence. German pilots intercepting these massive formations reported a new sensation, the feeling of being outnumbered. Fighter pilots accustomed to dominating the sky through superior training and equipment now found themselves swarmed by American escort fighters that hunted in packs and refused to disengage. The Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s were still excellent aircraft, but they were being flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots against an enemy that grew stronger each week. By April 1944, the character of German pilot reports had shifted noticeably. Gone was the confident language of autumn 1943. Now the reports spoke of being overwhelmed by numbers, of breaking off attacks due to escort fighter pressure, of watching damaged American bombers limp away because pursuing them meant exposure to defensive fire from their escorts. The psychological initiative had reversed. A Luftwaffe intelligence summary from April 1944, stamped with the highest security classification, contained a passage that would have been impossible to write 6 months earlier. The enemy has demonstrated the capability to sustain operations indefinitely despite losses previously considered decisive. His material superiority, combined with an apparently limitless supply of trained air crews and replacement aircraft, has created an operational environment increasingly unfavorable to defensive operations. Current attrition rates cannot be sustained. The report was correct, but incomplete. What the Germans were witnessing was not merely industrial capacity, but a fundamental difference in how the Americans conceptualized war itself. For the Luftwaffe, each aircraft represented an irreplaceable asset to be conserved. Each pilot a skilled craftsman whose loss diminished capability. For the Americans, aircraft were products on an assembly line. Pilots were graduates of a training pipeline, and both could be produced in quantities sufficient to overcome any tactical deficiency. This was the American way of war, substituting abundance for elegance, overwhelming problems with resources rather than solving them with technique. It was wasteful, expensive, and brutally effective. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former strength. Over Normandy that day, Allied aircraft flew more than 14,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe managed 2 combat sorties. German soldiers on the ground, veterans of the Eastern Front who had fought under conditions of rough air parity, stared at the sky in disbelief. The Americans owned the air so completely that their bombers operated with impunity. Their fighters flew armed reconnaissance missions against individual vehicles. Their observation aircraft directed artillery fire without interference. Klaus Reinhard, transferred to a support unit in France after his fighter group had been decimated in defensive operations, watched American bombers pass overhead in their geometrically perfect formations, 300, 400 at a time, and understood with absolute clarity that the war was lost. Not because the Americans were better pilots or tacticians, they were not, but because they possessed resources so vast that German skill was simply irrelevant. They could lose and lose and lose and still return the next day with fresh aircraft and new crews, an infinite conveyor belt of military power that no amount of German determination could derail. In August 1944, a young Luftwaffe pilot named Franz Stiegler, who had shown mercy to a crippled B-17 over Germany the previous December by escorting it to safety rather than finishing it off, was shot down and captured by advancing American forces. During his interrogation, an American intelligence officer asked him why German pilots had seemed so confident in 1943, despite the obvious material disadvantages. Stiegler considered the question carefully before answering. "We thought we were fighting a war. You were running a factory." It was the most concise summary possible of the fundamental disconnect. The Germans had assumed that combat was a test of will, skill, and courage, qualities they possessed in abundance. They had not understood that the Americans were waging industrial warfare, in which the decisive factor was not battlefield performance but production capacity. Every German tactical victory was meaningless when it could not prevent the strategic reality. More American bombers tomorrow, more the day after, more every day until the weight of material simply crushed resistance. The symbolic object that German pilots came to associate with American abundance was not a weapon or a piece of equipment but something more prosaic. Chewing gum. American airmen carried chewing gum as part of their rations, and German soldiers scavenging through crashed B-17s invariably found packages of Wrigley's spearmint or double mint among the wreckage. It became a dark joke among Luftwaffe pilots. The Americans have so much they can afford to chew food for entertainment. But behind the joke lay a deeper recognition. An enemy that could supply its forces with non-essential luxuries in the middle of a global war was an enemy with resources beyond comprehension. By the time the war ended in May 1945, the 8th Air Force alone had flown 1,793 combat missions, dropping 692,918 tons of bombs on European targets. The loss rate, which had seemed catastrophic in 1943, had proven sustainable. More than that, it had been acceptable within the American calculation of victory. The United States had produced, crewed, and operated a bombing force of such magnitude that German resistance became a matter of statistics rather than strategy. The Luftwaffe had fought with skill and determination, but it had been drowned in numbers. Major Heinrich Bäumer, the intelligence officer who had predicted American collapse in 1943, survived the war and was interviewed by U.S. Army historians in 1946. Asked about his failed assessments, he responded with professional honesty. "We understood American technology. We underestimated American will, but we completely failed to grasp American industry. We thought we were fighting a military force. We were fighting an economic system." The veterans who returned to their shattered air bases in 1945 carried with them a lesson that transcended tactics or technology. They had witnessed the collision between two philosophies of war, The German emphasis on qualitative superiority, on the skilled individual, on making do with less, and the American reliance on quantitative advantage, on the production line, on solving problems through overwhelming force. In that collision, quality had been buried under quantity so vast it redefined the possible. Klaus Reinhardt, discharged from a POW camp in 1946, returned to East Prussia to find his airfield overgrown with weeds, the runways cracked and broken. He walked the perimeter one last time, remembering the frost on the tarmac that January morning in 1943, the confidence with which they had met the American challenge. They had been wrong about everything except American courage. The Americans had proven brave enough, but more significantly, they had proven rich enough, patient enough, and determined enough to trade losses for time until their industrial machine ground down all opposition. The lesson endured long after the war ended. In modern industrialized warfare, abundance is a weapon more decisive than any individual technology or tactic. The Americans had not defeated the Luftwaffe through superior skill or courage. They had defeated it through superior production, logistics, and the willingness to accept casualties that would have crippled any other air force. They had returned after Schweinfurt, after Black Thursday, after every disaster, because they could afford to return. They had flown their geometric formations through fields of flak and swarms of fighters because somewhere in Seattle and Oklahoma City, new bombers were rolling off assembly lines faster than the Germans could shoot them down. The German pilots had thought they were fighting men. They had been fighting an economy. And economies, when mobilized for total war, possess a terrible patience. The patience to absorb losses, to rebuild, to return again and again until the enemy's will and resources are exhausted. That was what the Americans had brought to the skies over Europe. Not tactical brilliance, but strategic persistence backed by an industrial base so vast it could treat aircraft as expendable and crews as replaceable. In the end, the Americans had not just returned after the Germans thought them destroyed. They had returned stronger, in greater numbers, until the very idea of destruction became meaningless. That was the truth German pilots learned too late, watching the formations grow larger week by week, month by month, until the sky belonged entirely to the enemy, and the question was no longer whether the Americans would come, but only how many would arrive. The answer, invariably, was enough, always enough, more than enough. An inexhaustible supply of aluminum and courage, welded together on assembly lines that never stopped, crewed by young men who kept climbing into cockpits even when the odds promised their death, because somewhere in the American character lived a stubborn refusal to accept defeat when victory remained mathematically possible. The Germans had fought for glory, for survival, for an ideology that promised transcendence through will. The Americans had fought for a simpler proposition, that problems could be solved, enemies defeated, and wars won through the application of sufficient resources intelligently organized. Between these two philosophies, there could be only one victor. The side that treated war as mathematics had overcome the side that treated it as poetry. And in the wreckage of that collision lay the future of warfare itself, industrial, impersonal, and utterly unforgiving to those who lacked the capacity to match material with material, loss with replacement, destruction with reconstruction. The frost that had clung to Klaus Reinhardt's airfield that January morning had long since melted into memory, but the lesson remained, cold and permanent as winter itself. They had thought the Americans destroyed, and the Americans had returned. Again and again and again, until returning itself became the victory.